Hi, my name is Avril Sauter and you're listening to CCNA Wireless. So in this lesson we're going to talk about implementing controller-based Cisco wireless networks. And that means we have a wireless LAN controller that's going to be managing our lightweight access points. And so what we want to talk about in this lesson is how to get that wireless LAN controller up and running on your network. And so to do that, we're going to start with a discussion about the basic configuration. So what are the essential parts that you need to know about to get that wireless LAN controller working and supporting your lightweight access points? Well, like any network node, you want to make sure that you're effectively thinking about the configuration before you actually start configuring the box itself. So creating the plan, working out the IP addresses, the interfaces, etc., before you get that nice brand new wireless LAN controller out of the box. Now, when we look at wireless LAN controllers, they have physical ports on them, and we are going to have static and dynamic interfaces which we will map to those physical ports. Now, those physical ports connect to your wired network through a switch. And when you connect it to a switch, that switch needs to be configured as a trunk port, and it needs to be supporting the 802.1q encapsulation, because we're going to be setting up our wireless LAN on different VLANs and different SSIDs on different VLANs, and so we need some way of getting those tags to the wireless LAN controller. So you need to set up the switching interfaces as an 802.1q trunk to the port or ports on the wireless LAN controller. So what do you need to prepare? Let's go through some of the things that you need to capture as part of your plan. So the first thing I want to do is talk about the static controller interfaces. The first one is the management interface. Now, the management interface is used for connections to external services such as a AAA server or DHCP server if you're using a web server. So the management interface is actually really important for that kind of configuration. You'll also be using the management interface on the IP that you've given it as your way that you will access the web GUI for the wireless LAN controller. Also, the management interface is used for layer 2 communications between wireless LAN controllers. So if you're expecting your users to be able to roam between two wireless LAN controllers, this is the interface that will be used. So you assign an IP address, just like you see over in the picture on the right here, where that management interface has been put on VLAN 5 and has an IP address of 192.168.5.55 in this illustration. Now, the AP manager, as the name might suggest, is for communications between the access points and the wireless LAN controller, and is for layer 3 communications, and it will be tunneled from the AP through the network to the wireless LAN controller. And so when you set up an IP address for the AP manager, you're setting up the address of the end of the tunnel. So if an access point is sending something to the controller, that would be the source IP address where the packets are being sent. Now, the service port was not available on the 2100 that I use in my labs, unfortunately, because I really would have liked to have had a service port. The service port is for out-of-band management versus the management interface being for the in-band management. So the service port, this is where I'm going to connect to the service port, and I'm going to use that for the initial configuration of my wireless LAN controller, which is why I wish I'd had it in the lab. And you can connect it directly to the controller through an RJ45 connection, or you can come in through the network. Now, if you're coming in through the network, make sure that that cable that connects to the service port is set up as an access port, because for that connection, it doesn't have any VLAN, so it doesn't need any of the tagging or anything. And so for the management and AP management, those are trunk ports, and you want to map them to a physical port that can go to a trunk port to the switch. But the service port, that goes to the switch as an access port, unless you're going to do what I do, which is just directly connect. The virtual interface. Now this one, most of the time people give it a number of 1.1.1.1. That IP address does not need to be routable, right? So it's like a virtual IP address that you give it, and is relevant because you need it to be the same across multiple controllers if you're going to roam between those controllers. So watch for that, because it supports mobility to allow users to move across networks which have got different controllers. And so you need to make sure the virtual interface has the same IP address. But again, it doesn't need to be routable. You'd also use this as the address that your clients use when they're wanting to connect to a DHCP. So it's a DHCP relay capability. And it's also quite important if you're going to redirect your users when they connect the wireless LAN controller to a web page for your security authentication. You would also use this interface. I just wanted to point out to you over on the right in the picture, notice the AP manager and the management interfaces are both on VLAN identifier number 5, and what's really important here is that they have an IP address which is on the same subnet. So the management's on 292.168.5-55 and the AP manager on the same subnet at 192.168.5.5. You will see here, as I mentioned, the virtual is often set to 1.1.1.1. Now the guest one here is a wireless LAN, and we'll talk about that in a moment. That's a dynamic interface, and you'll notice in this picture I don't have a service port, and that's because I'm looking at the 2100 wireless LAN controller. The other thing to watch for is if you are going to set up multiple ports, then you may need multiple AP manager IP addresses associated and mapped to those ports. If you're using LAG to aggregate the ports together so they appear as one logical port, then you only need one AP manager. So look for that as well. So some of the things you want to think about when you're getting ready to configure your wireless LAN controller. So that nice shiny box that you can't wait to get your hands on and configure. Think about these things first. In addition to your static interfaces, where you need to assign IP addresses, masks, default routers, and VLAN IDs, and I just told you to make sure your management and your AP manager are on the same subnet. So think about how you're going to configure those static interfaces. You'll need a controller host name and system ID. The wireless LAN settings I'll cover a little bit later on. You can set them up when you initially set up your wireless LAN. What you normally do is just do it later. You get the wireless LAN up and running and configured, and then you'll come back and set up your wireless LANs. But think about them beforehand as to how many wireless LANs you're going to be supporting, etc., because that may make a difference to how you think about your VLAN IDs and your IP addresses. Think about your administrative accounts. What kind of accounts do you want to have? Do you want to have an account, for instance, that can set up just user accounts for guest visitors? Or do you want an administrative account that can set up all the user accounts? So think through what kind of administrative accounts you want to have. Then put your NTP server on board. So that stands for Network Time Protocol. And if you don't set the time and date correctly, then your APs are going to have trouble connecting to your wireless LAN controller. So think about what server do you want to use to make sure the time is kept consistent on the controller. If you don't want to use the server to do that, you can key in the time and the date. But as always, on any of these network components, you really want to use an NTP server if you can, because if they go off and come back online, you want your timing to be accurate. Now, to connect to your wireless LAN controller is no different from how you'd connect for a switch or a router, and the things that you learnt when you did CCNA apply here as well. So you can go in with a console access, just taking that RJ45 that you see there, putting that in the service port, connecting up your console cable. If you have a PC that only supports USB, then you need to have a serial to USB connector. Here's your COM port settings, and you'd use something like PuTTY or Hyperterminal. No different than you learned in CCNA. You can also connect to it through Telnet or SSH. Of course, you'll need IP connectivity in order to do that. But you can come in just like you would to a switch or a router into the controller. It is exactly the same. And in this case, of course, you'd use Hyperterminal or PuTTY or whatever your preference is. Also, if you come in through the service port, when the controller is first booting up and is loading its images and loading the various services, it will actually turn on the management interface. And so it's possible to get in through the web browser. I personally like to set it up in the CLI, my basic settings, and then come in through the web browser. But it is possible to come in through the web browser through that service port. And again, IP connectivity is required if you're going to come in through the switch. And if you're going to come into the controller, you'll probably set it up as an encrypted link, and so you'll probably want to set it up as HTTPS further down the road. So once you've done your initial configuration, you would come in through the web GUI via your switch, and you would secure it, and so you'd come in through HTTPS. It's fairly easy to use. Just bring up the browser, key in the IP address, and away you go. Now I wanted to talk about initial boot up and how to do that. So you get your box out of the package and you power it on. Now, if it's not a brand new box and you're not quite sure what the configuration is, then press the escape key during the boot up period, and you'll get these options coming up to run primary image, backup image, manually upgrade the primary image, change active boot image, clear configuration. I would suggest you take clear configuration, i.e. option 5, and reset your system to the factory defaults. Because if you don't, you're not quite sure. There could be a command in there that you don't see for whatever reason, and it will throw you out. Later on, you'll have to do quite a bit of troubleshooting. So I would strongly recommend that you select option 5 and reset it to factory settings. Once you've done that, what's going to happen is the initial configuration will channel along, and it will say starting this, starting that, and it will start all of the various services that it needs to start. And then eventually, after it's started everything, you'll get this message that says, "Welcome to the Cisco Wizard Configuration Tool." And this is an indication now that this doesn't have a configuration option on it, and you need to configure this wireless LAN controller. And so all of those things that we wrote down on the previous slide, you now need to have in your hand, because you're going to start keying in that information. The wireless LAN controller does not ship with a default configuration. You need to set it up through the wizard. And if you do clear configuration, exactly what it does is it clears it, and you'll have to set up the configuration. And again, I really recommend you do that if it's a new or one that you're refurnishing from another location. So what are some of the things that you can expect to see and be asked to put in when you configure your wireless LAN controller? And please bear in mind this isn't an exclusive list. Depending on your wireless LAN controller, there could be some other options and some other features. I'm just kind of giving you an indication of the primary ones that you're going to see. So the first one is the system name. That's relatively straightforward. Then you'd be asked for the administrator username and password, and you'll have to use that going forward when you connect to the wireless LAN controller. It will then ask you for a service interface, and you can type none or DHCP. Now what you're looking for here is the IP address that's given to the service port. And so if you say none, then it will just go ahead and set to the default, which is 192.168.1.1. So it'll be set to the default IP address, so you'll be able to get in and configure your wireless LAN controller. Alternatively, you can set it to DHCP. If you leave it as none, then you're going to need to configure the interface. So then it will ask you for the management interface and the AP manager interface. So you're going to key in the IP address and the subnet mask, and like I told you before, make sure those two are on the same subnet. Then it will ask you for that virtual interface, and remember, if you're planning to roam between wireless LAN controllers, make sure the virtual interface is the same as those other wireless LAN controllers. Then it will ask you for the mobility group, and again you want to make sure the mobility group is the same on all the wireless LAN controllers that you plan to be roaming between, or you want your users to be able to roam between. Once it's done that, then what's going to happen is it will then start asking you about whether you want to set up the radio aspects on the wireless LAN controller. And so when it asks for the country settings and you key in, oh, this is America, this is Europe, this is Canada, wherever you happen to be, then what happens is it's going to check to say, okay, what are the legal frequency channels you can be on, and what are the legal power settings? Because remember, the wireless LAN controller is driving down the configuration to the lightweight access points. So these are very important parameters. And then you can go in and set up your wireless interface options and whether or not you want to enable those radios. Then the last thing it asks, well, not the last thing, but one of the other things it asks for is to set up that NTP server, again for your time and date stamping. And again, really recommend that you're ready to set that up. You can actually enter the time and date, today's time and date. So much easier if you have a server on your network to do that. So as I mentioned, I normally always like to go through the CLI when I'm first configuring up a wireless LAN controller. Once I've got it configured to this stage and I've gone through the CLI configuration wizard, then I will use that management interface IP address and come back in through the web GUI, and then in the web GUI I can then set up the more advanced capabilities. Now in this section we want to talk about how to configure wireless LANs, and we're going to do a little bit of theory, a little bit of planning, and then I'm going to show you how to do it. And before we get in and actually talk about it, I want to give you a quick overview of the wireless LAN controller. So we're going to take a quick look at our wireless LAN controller, and to do that I'm just going to log into it on https:// and then the IP address of the management interface. And so it's brought up the login screen. I can log in there. Username Avril, and enter the password. Okay, so I'm into my wireless LAN controller. So the first thing I want to do is just show you the menu options that you have on the top. So the first one you can see is highlighted with orange underneath. This is the monitor, and from here I can view the status of both the wireless LAN controller and access points and even clients associated and attached with those access points. And if you come down here, you can see I currently have 2 access points connected and I have no clients connected to those access points. The next one is the wireless LAN tab. And this is where I'd come if I want to configure and manage my wireless LAN. So if I want to set up a new wireless LAN with a new SSID, or if I want to change any of the settings, this is where I'd come to the wireless LAN screen. And you can see I already have 3 wireless LANs set up. I've got my lab access point, employee secure, and guest. Over here then I have the controller tab. And the controller tab is the one where I can come in and configure things that would be system-wide, and is also where I come in and define my interfaces. So here you can see some general settings. If I want to configure my interfaces, I will come here, and you can see here that I have a management interface and an AP manager interface. They're on the same subnet. They are static interfaces, and I have them set up as untagged, which means I set the VLAN ID as 0. You can see my virtual interface here set to all ones. And again, I don't have a service port static interface because I don't have a service port on the 2100. So let me go over to the wireless tab. So the wireless tab is where I actually go in and configure and manage my access points. The access point radios and anything to do with the RF I'm going to do in the wireless tab. So the wireless LAN, I set up the wireless LAN, so give it an SSID, etc. But if I want to do anything with the radio settings, then I come here to the wireless tab. The security tab here is the one that I use if I want to configure the wireless access point to do a AAA server. So if I want to set the security settings actually off the wireless LAN controller itself, or if I want to set anything up about using an external radio server or any external security settings. The management tab here, this is the one where if I wanted to perform any local management of the system. So this is where I would set up things like SNMP, my Telnet SSH connections if I wanted to allow that, my serial port. The local management user over here, this is where I would set up if I wanted to set up a local administrator like a lobby ambassador account, I would do that here. The command tab here, this is where I can start controlling the files, what images, the system status, the reset controls, all of that is managed here. So I can do it through the CLI, or I can come in here and do it through this interface here. And then I've got the help here, which of course brings up another page. And this allows me here to go through and look at each of these different interfaces. Notice it's showing all the different tabs. And so I can learn how to use the wireless LAN controller by just clicking on these various tabs. The other thing I wanted to point out here was the save configuration. If you make any changes, save your configuration, because then otherwise if a reboot occurs, you're going to lose those configuration changes. So always remember to change your configuration. You can also ping. So I could ping access points and DHCP servers, etc. from the wireless LAN controller just to verify connectivity, much like you could do from the CLI interface. Here's the logout. Of course, you always want to log out. And here is refresh. So particularly if I just made some changes, I'm bringing up a new access point, I can just refresh the page to see access point connecting. So that concludes the demo. Again, we're just looking at the top level GUI here to make sure you're comfortable with how the wireless LAN controller looks, where to find different functionality. Now, to create a wireless LAN, there's several steps you have to go through. The first, you have to create the dynamic interface for the wireless LAN. Then you have to create the wireless LAN, and then you have to map the wireless LAN to the interface. And so when you're planning to do a wireless LAN deployment, you need to think through, what is the information I need before I get to the wireless LAN controller and start configuring it. So the first thing you need to do is, are you going to give your AP host names? You want to set up your dynamic interface, and to do that you want to think about, well, what network IP addresses am I going to give my dynamic interface? And for that network IP address, what is the defaulter's IP address? What is the VLAN that I plan to associate with this dynamic interface? And then what port is this dynamic interface going to map to? So once I've planned my interface, then I need to plan, well, what do I want for my wireless LAN? And so when I think about my wireless LAN, I want to think about a profile name. A profile name is only locally significant. Again, it's useful to think about for consistency and for ease of use and for people administrating the system. Then you want to think of the SSID for your wireless LAN. And again, you may want to set up multiple SSIDs, so multiple wireless LANs. So your wireless LAN SSID, the 802.11 standard mandates that it's up to 32 characters. It is case sensitive, and there's a whole bunch of characters that you cannot use. And so, you normally call it something like company A, employee connection, something like that. And then you give your wireless LAN an ID. And again, this only has local significance, like the profile name, within the wireless LAN controller, and it's a numeric value. And then in addition to thinking about, here's how I set up the interfaces, here's how I set up the wireless LANs, the other thing you need to think about is, how do my access points going to connect to the wireless LAN controller? The first thing they need to do is to get an IP address. So am I going to use a DHCP server? Will I use the controller to do that? Will I have a separate DHCP server? If I set up a DHCP server that's an external DHCP server, then I need to use option 43 to make sure that not only can the access point get an IP address, but it can get the management IP address and the AP manager IP address as well. So then it knows how to find the wireless LAN controller. I want to think about my network IP addresses and my masks that I want to assign, and I want to think about where my default router is going to be. You also might want to set up a DNS, so the access points can say, I am a 3500 access point and I'm looking for a wireless LAN controller, help me. So you can set up DNS capabilities to help also find the wireless LAN controllers. So now that we've talked about how to plan and to think about the things that surround the deployment of the wireless LAN controller, let's go ahead and set up a wireless LAN controller. So let's go back to our wireless LAN controller. First thing I want to do is set up an interface, and you would know where to find that now is under the controller tab and then interfaces. And then I can come over here and select new, and I want to create an interface, and I'm just going to call it VLAN 8, and of course I'm going to give it number 8 as well. Click apply. Now what you can see here is one of the first things I need to do is select the port number, and I'm going to map all of my traffic to port 1, and that's because I'm using the 2100. You may decide to use multiple physical ports, or you may be looking to aggregate all your ports together. But this is when you define the physical port that you're mapping this interface to, and I'm putting it on port 1 because I have one physical connection from my wireless LAN controller to the switch, and that's port 1. You can see my VLAN identifier is here. I'm now going to give this an IP address, and of course I have planned this all out prior to keying it all in, and a subnet mask of 255.255.255.0, and my mask is my default gateway here is just 8.1, and I'm using an external DHCP server, so I'm going to key in the address of that. And I'm done. This is all there is to keying in and creating your interface. And again, as long as you've thought through the addressing scheme, you won't have a problem of setting up this interface. And now you can see I've set up VLAN identifier 8, IP address, and it's a dynamic interface. So now I want to go ahead and create the wireless LAN. I come here and click on wireless LAN, and I want to create a new wireless LAN. So I hit go. Here's my type, wireless LAN, and I want to give it a profile name and an SSID. So my profile name, I'll just call it accounting. And I'm going to give it the same SSID as my profile name. And again, my profile name only has local meaning, but my SSID is broadcasted out. Here it gives me the opportunity to set up my wireless LAN ID, and it should just default to the next one, but I've got a feeling I've already used 4, so I'm just going to call this 5 and hit apply. Now here you can see it says accounting, etc. And this is where I enable the wireless LAN. Now here I apply where I'm applying this to, so I have an opportunity here. I'm going to apply it to all. If I wanted my accounting just to be able to set up on legacy devices, I could say, oh, G only, but I'm going to let them connect on all. And this is where I map it to the interface. And so here I'm going to map it to VLAN 8. That was the interface that I had created. And again, you may want to give it more meaningful names, but for tracking purposes, I find it in the lab useful just to use lab VLAN names. And then I check apply, and that is done. At this point in time, I might want to go across and set the security settings. Here, I'm just going to leave it as completely open on the layer 2 and also on the layer 3. So I'm just going to hit apply again. So now we come back and look at the wireless LANs. And you can see here that my wireless LAN has been set up. Here I gave it the ID 4, and you can see that the administrative name is enabled. If I make any mistakes, I can always come over here and click on this, and I can remove it, etc. So that wireless LAN is now available to all my access points. So I am going to go and connect my HP laptop to that. I'm going to select monitor, and let's see if we can see whether the client has successfully connected to it. So you can see I still got my 2 access points up, and look at this, I now have 1 client connected. So let's go take a look at that client, and here you can see here is my laptop, and I am successfully connected to the accounting wireless LAN. So again, what we did in this demo is I showed you I set up a new interface, I then set a wireless LAN up, I map my wireless LAN to that interface, I then made that available to all of my access points, and then I came in and I had my client connect to that wireless LAN, and you can now see it that is associated correctly to that new wireless LAN. Hope that you found this demo to be productive. Thank you. So the last thing I want to talk about is making sure that wireless LAN controller correctly connecting to the wired network. And so you've configured your wireless LAN settings. What do you have to do to the switch? So you've created a new VLAN ID. So you need to make sure that the switch that the wireless LAN controller is connecting to supports that VLAN ID. So you go in and configure VLAN and then the ID. In our case it was VLAN 8. Optionally, you can configure a layer 3 VLAN interface. In fact, I always do. So I go in and create interface VLAN 8 and give it an IP address. The other thing you need to do is you need to make sure the VLAN is added to the port that the switch is connected to. So the command for that is switch port trunk allowed and then put the VLAN. So I added VLAN 8, so I'd want to have VLAN 5 to 8 plus 60 in my lab configuration. Optionally, you want to think about where your DHCP server is. So do you want an external DHCP server? Do you want to run it on the switch? Do you want to run it on the wireless LAN controller? In my lab, I've configured it on the switch, and so you would go in there and configure the appropriate DHCP pool to make sure that the client leases the appropriate IP address. Then you want to save the configuration on your switch, and of course you should have saved it on your wireless LAN controller as well. Exit the device and you're done on the switch. So it's relatively simple. You just need to remember, if you create a new VLAN on your wireless LAN controller, that you make sure you create it on the switch as well. Now, to verify the connectivity, I went on to my laptop and I connected, and you saw that I connected through the monitor tab on the wireless LAN controller. On my PC, I also saw this. So I saw that it was displaying the SSID accounting, and I was able to click on it and I was able to connect to it. And then I can verify that I have IP connectivity by pinging the gateway controller. If I can associate but not get an IP address, then that's an indication that I need to start troubleshooting. So as well as seeing it successfully associate on the wireless LAN controller, you also want to get in there and issue a ping to your gateway. So to wrap up this lesson, a few key terms. Management interface. Remember, this is your in-band communications where your controller will talk to external nodes such as a AAA, such as your DHCP, etc. Is also the interface that you use if you want to get in and access the web GUI to change the wireless LAN controller, and you saw that I did that. And is also important from point of view of mobility management, because my wireless LAN controllers will talk at the layer 2 using this interface. Now the AP Manager interface, this is the one that controls communications between my wireless LAN controller and the access points. The service port, this is for your out-of-band controller interface, is used, really what it's really used for is when you're first bringing up the wireless LAN controller. Again, if you're connecting to the service port through a switch, set that switch interface up as an access port, whereas your management interface and your AP management, those need to be through a trunk port on the switch. The virtual interface, again, is not meant to be routable. This is used for some layer 3 functionalities such as mobility, security, relay of your DHCP. The dynamic interfaces, these are the important ones that you will map your wireless LANs and VLANs to. So the dynamic interfaces, you create those for your wireless LANs. This is very important to understand this module of how you get your wireless LAN controller up. I hope you found it really valuable, and don't hesitate to listen to it several times and do the demos yourself, because when you touch this, this is really when you'll start to understand what exactly is happening in the wireless LAN controller. And best of luck with this. Thank you.